presentation. That would be my presentation. So now I'm in the awkward position of doing a self-introduction. I'm going to be talking again on behalf of IPIECA about oil spill response in a pandemic. So I'm the global lead for Chevron's emergency management organization, and also the co-lead for our environmental response team, along with being coordinator for all of our emergency teams at Chevron. I'm also the vice chair for technical stewardship at IPIECA, and I've got a PhD in ecology, so that's my background. So I'm going to move on and just start bringing up my presentation. Okay. Can someone respond that they can see that brought up? Move the enter presentation view.
We can.
Okay, smashing. And then I'm also going to start a timer because I can't monitor myself on this. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I'm going to be talking generally about how we do oil spill response in a pandemic situation. I'm just going to minimize. So I have that little screen in front. I'm just moving it. Let's see, that's gone. Okay, so how do we do oil spill response in a pandemic? So this was something that, last year when the pandemic hit us, it was something that became very, very apparent very quickly that this was going to be around for some time. And we really needed to kind of come together and think about, in the event of an oil spill, how we would actually manage a response based on the kind of the new world in which we were living in. And we initially held a meeting in July of last year. And we had quite a lot of interest from a number of groups, I think maybe about 20 different people. And we split these groups into physical response considerations, so when you're actually on the ground responding, and a second group, which was how we would do a virtual response, so kind of responding remotely, both under these kind of pandemic conditions. And then we identified a number of response priorities. We did kind of like a little poll to understand, like, what people saw as being the things that we needed to produce and what was going to be really helpful to organizations. And so we looked at the different pandemic response models. So how could you respond? Like, whether it's all in person or whether it's all virtual and anything in between. We looked at the virtual incident management team etiquette, hints and tips. So when you're online, what is it that we need to be thinking about that we wouldn't normally be thinking about in a response? We looked at the virtual IMT, so that's the incident management team lessons learned. So what could we learn from virtual response experience? We also looked at training and exercise options as well. So how do we make it work from a training and exercise perspective? Because normally we would run a tabletop, or we would do a tier 2 or tier 3 exercise in place. So this was very different. We also looked at physical response lessons learned. So if you were responding in person, what do we need to think about? Mutual aid also became a lot more important in this new world. And then we also decided to create a checklist as well. So I do want to note, again, this is something that is in, I guess we have all the drafts, but they're actually kind of polishing them up, and they should be released later this year. Oops, in the wrong direction. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is pandemic response models. And so I wanted to also make sure that, like I said, this was a multitude of people, and just recognizing the different companies and different organizations that were involved in this. So Andy Keane and Casey Sullivan from BP and Shell supported on this. And so what they were looking at was the whole concept was, how we adapt. And what they were looking at was response teams as units. So how do we actually do this facilitation? How do we look at alternative ways on responding to an incident? And the key things were virtual. So people, for example, at home using software, or remote. So people meeting and working face-to-face, but a command post that's in a different location from where the incident was actually taking place. And they looked at this whole kind of idea of different units. So response teams as units. So you have an expanded incident management team. So this is something that we would use for a large scale incident. So a lot of people, so we have, and that would require expertise at a global level, so with a large number of individuals. And that would be one of the most complex types of responses that we'd be trying to mount. We also have the local incident management team. So that'd be a tier 1, tier 2, and that would be using local staff, government, contracted resources, and then lastly, that initial response team. So that's for maybe for the smaller incidents. And the whole idea is, some of this would be familiar with. We have the increasing incident complexity and scale at the bottom with the resource requirements going up the side. So notification is, we always do our notifications. We have a site response, it's very typical. We have a local response, which is very typical. A local incident management team, which is very typical. But now we're bringing in these couple of additional kind of new components, so this virtual support and this expanded incident management team. So that's where it is going to get more complex, and we're going to be using kind of more requirements to manage that. And then this kind of ranges, the different models really range from full on face-to-face. You can also have your local IMT teams with virtual support. You can have your forward operating model. So you have your local team in place with a virtual incident management team, or you could have your forward operating team with a remote IMT. And then lastly, it could be full virtual. And they also kind of broke this down. They looked at all the benefits and the advantages of doing, one way versus another. So if you're there in place and you do face-to-face, that's something that you're really going to be thinking about quarantine. You're going to be thinking about travel restrictions. You've got to think about all the precautions and additional rotation times. If you're fully virtual, you don't have the quarantine times, you don't have the travel restrictions, but you could also be seen as being very disconnected from a response from the local government and also from local stakeholders. So it's really trying to kind of find that balance between all the different models and what would work in the different incidences. And as we know, different locations may have different and varying amounts of transmission or cases. So we'd have to be kind of base it on that. And so other considerations we'd be thinking about is a preference for interface. The government or other stakeholders may absolutely need us face-to-face, or maybe it's something that we could have a lot of kind of virtual support. It may be very technical. People don't need to be there in place, but they can actually provide input. We also need to look at, who's going to be on the IMT as well for approving virtual access. But a big part of this is the public perception as well. So whether we're fully virtual or fully face-to-face. And there's very, very different perceptions in that. So being aware of those. Okay, so the next one is a virtual IMT etiquette hints and tips. I asked Andy for a photo and he stupidly gave me one. So I am using it in my title slide. So these are some of the things that they found. So a lot of it is, so we have challenges around the unfamiliarity of tools. If it's your platforms, so for example, Chevron uses Teams, we're all very familiar about that. But if you're bringing in contractors, they may not be as familiar with the tools that you use on a day-to-day basis now, and that can actually, cause some you have to have a learning curve. You also have to have the agreed platform. What is it that everyone agrees to be using? You also have the common operating picture and the incident action plan software. And how does that integrate into the platform that you're using? Another thing that was identified was a buddy up system. As you know, responses can be quite stressful. When you're in location, face to face, you can see people that may be getting a little bit more stress. You can see the way that they're holding their bodies, but when they're remote, you might not be seeing that, but you're still getting all the same requests. You're still having to get on numerous calls. And so, they have this recommendation that you have somebody that you're connected with and you just keep an eye on each other. Being proactive, making sure that you understand, what the priorities are, kind of checking in is really important. Sometimes if you're working by yourself, you might get off track a little bit. Dedicated IT resources are now really critical. Having an IT challenge when you're virtual could really cause a lot of problems. If you're in a situation locally, you can just ask for a new computer. And if you're lucky, you'll get one. But if you're remote, then you could be cut off, right? If you lose internet connection. And then the other challenge they have is day jobs. So, there may be situations, people have families, and that could be challenging to be working in that sort of situation. Another thing, a couple of other things that they have kind of put together is announcing arrival. So, when you're having meetings, that's really important, having backups or deputies, that if the main presenter is lost, they can step in, staying on mute when not speaking, and these are things I think we're very familiar with now, right? And the one thing that I really love is this kind of background, these position backgrounds. So depending on what position you're in a response, like if you're in command or planning or operations, clearly putting that on there, you can instantaneously see. And so typically we'd wear the vest, colored vest, and you can see, who's doing what. And now we have to kind of change our thinking. So I think this is really great. Okay, and then we also put together some virtual IMT lessons learned. Again, you can see a number of different people from different companies, BP, Total, Equinor, OSRL, Total, and ExxonMobil worked on putting this together. And they kind of developed some of these lessons learned. So this is just really a table. I'm not going to go through it, but there's different sections. And so what they said was, what are the particular issues like IT tools, the process and facilitation, the protocols, different roles, third-party engagement, training, and human factors. And so they tried to identify what potential issues would be from being on a virtual response, try to kind of define what those challenges are, and then try to actually document some of the solutions. So we tried to kind of build this out. So, we have it on hand and aware of potential pitfalls. Okay, so moving on, the next group was, this is a group with ExxonMobil, Shell, and myself. We worked on developing, how do we do training and exercise virtually? And so, oops, I think I went the wrong direction. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, so what we did for this was we created Injects. So for different phases of a response, so you have the initial response, you have the mobilization, you have demobilization, you have the response in the command center, response in the field. We looked at, if you're going to provide Injects and test your readiness in a pandemic, which is kind of, these are quite unique. What Injects could we provide? So we started, adding things. So for example, travel assessment. So who will assess the country's COVID-19 status? So, if you have a response in a different country, who's responsible for that? And who will assess the travel restrictions for deployment? So these are all very, very valid questions. And we're trying to kind of think ahead as to, who's going to be responsible. And so you could take these ideas and utilize them as injects and exercises to test their readiness in a pandemic. So the next group, this was physical response. So now we're moving away from the virtual, we're moving into physical. So this is the group that I was the lead of. This is Shell, Noble, and API was working this. So API is the American Petroleum Institute. And they also did a lessons learned as well. So they looked at physical lessons. So if you're working on in the field, again, what are the challenges? What are the solutions? What are the potential issues? And so they kind of broke this up in different sections. They looked at production offshore, production onshore, transportation, and logistics. And these are some kind of examples of some of the solutions, but they were kind of looking at, where these challenges might be and trying to kind of determine solutions and put together some tables on this. So again, very, very useful and something to kind of help us prepare for any potential incident. Next, we had a group that developed a checklist for a tactical response in a pandemic. And so this was MSRC, OSRL, and BP. So it's a tremendous help there. And this was like 2 pages of tactical checklist. And they looked at, for response, what are the things that you would need to set up if you were there in person? So for example, testing, screening checks, isolation, quarantine protocol. So these are things that you'd want to check off to make sure that they're in place for a pandemic and you'd be able to utilize this. And then also, what the safety officer should be monitoring and also the public information should be engaging. So they really tried to kind of think this out. They've kind of created the tools. Hopefully it's just kind of ready to go if and as needed. And then lastly, mutual aid. So this was something that was put together by ExxonMobil, OSRL, and IPIECA, OSRL. And they looked at mutual aid because this mutual aid model is going to be far more important in a pandemic. Mutual aid is something that we typically think about when we do larger responses, that we use regional or international resources and bring them in. So we're asking for mutual aid. If you've got extra people out there, can you contract them and bring them in? and this was really going to, so this is really going to help drive and help us on an incident, because the idea is that we don't want to be moving people in. So if there are people locally, say for example, we're in an exploration area where our company is, but there's also other companies in the area, it's a lot easier to maybe leverage some of those people that are trained than fly a lot of other people in. And there are some really good examples of this that have already been done. There's been some work done in Angola. There's also been some work done in Australia, and there's templates of mutual aid agreements out there. So IOGP, so International Oil and Gas Producers, and IPIECA both have these template agreements. Again, there's always like pluses and minuses with everything. The potential barriers of doing mutual aid is, the liability of the indemnity. If I'm using someone else from a different company and they make a very poor decision, whose responsibility is that? The government might have shifting priorities. So, that can mean anything. It may also mean politics. If it's your border nation and you don't have good relations, and it's just across the border, but would you really want to help? Cross-boundary cooperation or a lack of it could be a real challenge. You might be working in very different regulatory environments. So, how do you kind of work together? And then there's also maybe other points of failure as well. And then there's the enablers or the support. So there are things out there that can help us. And like we said, there's this template for mutual aid that's available. There's also Global Initiatives program, and this is through IPIECA and the International Maritime Organization. So they have partnerships in all these different regions throughout the world. And so those relationships have already been developed in kind of, and helping kind of proving the ground for mutual aid. So they bring people together in those regions, and that's where maybe that could be very supportive of developing these mutual aid agreements. Also having cross-boundary exercises. So what happens if, for example, there's an oil spill in Canada and it comes into the US, or an oil spill in the US that goes into Canada? Having exercises to test how that would work is really important. And then lastly, where are these opportunities? Like, where do we need them to be, and putting this in place. So some of the key recommendations, obviously, if there's a chance to develop a mutual aid, we recommend acting now, like, putting that together, starting to kind of work that. These can take a little bit of time to get, parties to agree. Doing risk assessment of operations against the worst case scenario. So where do you have the most risk? Where would a mutual aid agreement most benefit you? Identifying key roles and gaps, specialists where using mutual aid will bring in extra resilience. So again, but basing it on the risk-based assessment could be very important. Identifying alternative sources of capability. So it's not just other kind of oil and gas producers, but it's also other organizations. It may be public, private, local institutions, agencies, academia. All of these have tremendous resources. So being aware of all these different people that could actually be brought in to help is very important. Leveraging response models. So, whether you're hybridizing that kind of remote or virtual capabilities, understanding what that could be looking like, is a part of that. And then testing the protocols. So, doing exercises and kind of test the effectiveness of that. See where your gaps are in peacetime is definitely preferable than when it's go time. Okay, so this is I think my last slide. So I've shown you some of the things that, like I said, there was a lot of people that worked on this from all these different companies. They did a tremendous job trying to pull this all together and put this together for us. This is something that we do have for 2021 funding to review, reformat, and produce finished products. So we all kind of worked on it individually. It kind of, it needs to be polished and kind of just get it out there. And we're working on doing that. There are some additional factors to consider. So competency building and virtual IMTs, getting comfortable in this new world and doing the trainings and exercises online, using technology to develop virtual response. So there's some really interesting technology out there, real wear glasses, for example, so you can wear technology and other people can stream and kind of see as you're working. So you could be turning a valve and they could say, no, turn it the other way, or like, press the button above. So you're able to have direct feeds into the control room and have experts, in one location directing someone actually on the ground. Another example is, using a follow the sun response. So if you have an international response, but you have a lot of capability in your headquarters, and maybe you have, some other capability somewhere, maybe you could have 3 teams that each work 8 hours around the world. So, you might have 24 hours of people working on things, and you hand off the plans to the next group and they continue working on it. So there's ways you could leverage technology to support on a large response. And then human factors. Obviously, this is something different. We're working, in our homes right now. But how do you manage something high pressure at home, but you've also got your home life at the same time? So that can be really challenging. If you've got family or other people that you're living with, or responsibilities like pets, or you're a carer. How do we manage that stress in the workplace versus kind of, when you might have people, you might have a lot more eyes on people. And then maybe other things out there as well. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation. So thank you to all the different organizations that helped. And there's Andy again. He was the co-lead, so he gets another mention with his photo right up front and center. Thank you.